Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Danecko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. So today we are starting our 3-part journey with cyanide.
3 parts plus a microdose.
4-part journey with cyanide.
Yeah.
For our valued patrons. Join us on Patreon for all the fun of microdoses.
Yeah.
So Kayla, where are you taking us first with cyanide?
Man, today's episode is a bummer. So I'm taking us to the Holocaust. We're going to talk Nazi Germany and concentration camps. So big trigger warning up top for anti-Semitism and discussion of genocide and all of that. If that's not something that you can handle.
And all of the sadness that goes with that.
Yeah.
We won't hold it against you for tuning out of this episode.
Not at all. But so yeah, as with any story involving World War II and the Holocaust, it's tragic and it's horrifying, but it's also long and complex. And it would be an oversimplification to attempt to pin the Holocaust on any single person. I mean, anybody who's really
That's fair.
Thought about it beyond what you're kind of told as a kid to understand it, understands it wasn't just Hitler, it was a lot of people.
No, there were a lot of people who were yes men for Hitler. It was not just Hitler.
Exactly. Yeah.
He had a lot of accomplices in the matter.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, we need to understand that his accomplices were also people, citizens, employees who were radicalized enough that, they killed or helped to kill fellow Germans, and 6 million Jewish people and millions of other people who were considered, lesser than. So, yeah. I don't want to oversimplify the story at all. But of course, we're going to be focusing on a pretty niche part of it. We're not going to go into too many gory details with it, but we're going to be very focused. So, yeah, and of course it wasn't every German. It was a lot of Germans. It was a lot of people outside of Germany. But there were a lot of people who bought into the propaganda of the Nazi Party. And I guess I also want to preface it by saying that I myself am not Jewish. I'm not a scholar of Judaism or Jewish history. But it's not hard for me to look at it and be like, oh, that's anti-Semitism. And it's also kind of lazy because every conspiracy theory that I know about, when somebody's explained it to me down to the skeleton of it, is anti-Semitism. So anytime that somebody wants to throw Jewish people under the bus, I'm like, that's fucking creative. That's real fucking cool of you. Because they've been doing that to Jewish people literally since the Black Death in the 14th century. I knew about that, but then for this episode I was like, okay, I want to dig because I want to know, not having that cultural background, that oral history or anything, how long have people had anti-Semitism at the root of their fears and their scapegoating,
Yeah,
and
how far back does it go? Because I'm familiar with the Holocaust, but beyond that, how far are we going?
So the earliest pogrom, which I thought a pogrom was a place, but it's actually an organized riot almost against a certain group of people. The earliest pogrom against Jewish people was in Roman Alexandria, Egypt in the year 38 CE.
So way the fuck back.
Way the fuck back. And that's, how it escalated. It escalated to a pogrom in 38, which means that there was already some
prevalent.
Exactly.
This is just more organized.
Right. Anti-Semitism in text, written text, can be traced back to the early 3rd century BCE in Egypt. So at least that far back, people were writing it down and then dispelling it amongst other people who could read and write. So it's been going on a long time. But in the year 38, political tensions increased between the ethnic Jews and the Greeks, and the property of the Jews was destroyed, and they were killed. Their property was looted. They were forced from their homes into a ghetto, which is kind of what I thought pogroms were ghettos, but it's not. And then the ghetto was blockaded and set on fire, and anybody who tried to escape was killed.
Jeebus.
Yeah, 38 CE. So, as I said, I don't have any background. This is just what I looked up for this episode, what I learned to educate myself. But, you know, I found it worth mentioning that it's just, to me, it's lazy. Like, honestly,
tale as old as time.
Yeah, it's a tale as old as time. It's lazy. Like, whenever anybody wants to blame Jewish people, it's just like, why are you being so uncreative, I suppose? But if you do want to know more about somebody who's more well-informed and not from somebody who is non-Jewish, which is not where you should be getting the majority of your information from, there is a social media person called Jewitches, and they're on Instagram, they're on TikTok, they have their own podcast, and I think they're a more appropriate person to, you know, use as a source, learn of more sources from. I recommend them. They're pretty cool.
Have to check them out.
Yeah. So, where I really want to actually delve into this story is just before World War I. The population of the world had increased so dramatically around that time that agriculture was struggling to keep up with it. Farmers already knew that they could plant certain crops which would help return nitrogen to the soil, and they knew that manure and animal bones could be spread to add more nitrogen. And I don't know if they knew it was nitrogen. I mean, around World War I, they probably realized that it was nitrogen.
They knew that it helped.
They knew that it helped. They knew that it fertilized. So this was the only way that they were able to achieve nitrogen fixation, because it takes nitrogen from the air and fixes it to the soil. So the manure fixes to the soil, animal bones, you know, the animals have fixed it within their system and put it into their bones, and then that goes into the soil. But we had no way to just fix it. Like, we had to get it from these animal sources. And it's absolutely essential to crops. Without it, crops failed. They weren't successful enough to support the booming populations of major cities, and especially in England. And so, you know, England was able to afford all of the good crops, and everybody else was really suffering as a result. So there was really this, like, food scarcity problem because of the haves and the have-nots. And so around World War I, there were a lot of talks, especially in the chemistry community, about we absolutely have to find a way to fix nitrogen into the soil. Otherwise, like, we're kind of doomed, you know?
So what do we do, or who helped?
Well, the person who came to the world's rescue on this was a Jewish chemist named Fritz Haber, who in 1919 was actually awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the Haber-Bosch process, which was developed in 1911 by Haber and his partner, Carl Bosch. And this process created ammonia by fixing airborne nitrogen to hydrogen using an iron catalyst. It was a huge deal. They were able to do it commercially after a couple of years. And he essentially created a solution to one of the problems which led to world hunger. Like, big deal. There's a reason they gave him the Nobel Prize. Mm-hmm. Immediately, though, the work which was so essential for the survival of humanity began to take on a dark shade, because nitrogen is also a key element in explosives, which is kind of ironic because have you heard of the story of, like, how the Nobel Prize Foundation got started?
I have not.
So Nobel actually created TNT, and he created it because of mining, and so it made mining far more efficient. And then he read a misprinted version of his obituary. Somebody thought he died, so they printed his obituary, and he saw it. And they were basically saying that he was like a war profiteer or something like that, because explosives have been used to kill people. And he was like, oh, fuck, this can't be my legacy. So he created the Nobel Prize.
Nobel Prize. Like, yeah. Okay, let me shift the focus of my lifetime to something else.
Right. But I think there's no Nobel Prize for mathematics, because I think his wife cheated on him with a mathematician.
Oh, the shade.
The shade. Yeah. So they have their own version of the Nobel Prize because they got left out. Okay, but back to Fritz Haber. We could do an entire episode on this guy alone, and we probably should do it in the future, because his work during World War I that I can't focus on for this episode, it's too much. This work, though, it earned him the moniker the father of chemical warfare. And
Ooh.
he is pretty much the reason why World War One is referred to as the Chemists' War.
Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So he's a pretty complicated guy, pretty controversial because he helped find a solution for one of the branches of, world hunger, but he was also the father of chemical warfare. Like, it was not good.
So he's helping people live and killing at the same time.
Yeah, and killing. He killing them with mustard, phosgene, and chlorine gas. Like, it was not good stuff. Yeah.
Not a good time.
Yeah, and around this same time, cyanide was also a fairly new poison being used. Liquid hydrocyanic acid, which is also called prussic acid because it could be derived from Prussian blue dye, it was discovered near the end of the 18th century. And the reason that all of this was happening at the same time is because we were doing a lot of research into dyes. And so there was just a lot of medicines and poisons that we found as a result of the dye industry.
Excellent.
Yeah, and after we found it, we pretty soon realized that it's a pretty potent poison.
And so how does it act as a poison?
When it's heated to 79 degrees Fahrenheit, hydrocyanic acid vaporizes and it becomes a lethal gas that starves the cells of oxygen and leads to a quick, albeit painful, suffocating death. So you do actually turn blue with cyanide a little bit because you're suffocating on a cellular level, though. And this happens to
Not
both...
just because you're deprived of air, your whole body is
body's deprived of air.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And this happens to mammals and insects. So it was first exploited by the California orange growers in the 1880s to fumigate their orchards, but then the practice was extended to mills and ships all over the United States, and then Spain, Italy, South Africa for pesticide control.
Everybody's loving the hydrocyanic acid.
Yeah, works like a motherfucking charm.
Yeah, let's get it everywhere, kill all the bugs. And other pests too, like we're using it on like rats and things like that as well.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, in the 1910s, a company called Degussa began to direct much of their attention towards cyanide because the board of the company had noted that several German publications were already discussing the uses of cyanide for saving wartime food storages and fumigating their uniforms. So the uniforms had lice in them, and they were using the cyanide to fumigate it, which was a huge deal. Like, they were talking about it so much, only because it was effective and you could just spray it, whatever, and use however much of it you wanted, which is, if you think about the trucks that sprayed the pesticides, like, that's probably what it was. Just like,
Right.
with total abandon, spray cyanide everywhere. But the lice on the uniforms was particularly important because trench fever was actually directly caused by lice and caused many, many deaths on the fields and the trenches of World War I. So
not even just like wartime deaths, like you're getting shot or grenade, things like that, but bugs are getting you.
Bugs are getting you, yeah. And so the ability to have cyanide effectively fumigate these uniforms without causing damage to the textile or to the growing foods that it was being used to fumigate was like amazing. It was great.
So did they know that it was poisonous to humans at this time, though?
Yeah, they probably knew. I mean, again, they were just using it kind of with abandon. They knew it was...
They're like, this works for the bug problem. Let's focus on that.
Yeah. Well, there was that. They knew you could use it on mammals, and so it's kind of like, that logical extension. Like, well, if it works on mammals, it probably works on humans. And in fact, it does work on humans. And there was interest in using gaseous hydrogen cyanide as a chemical weapon in war, because this was the chemists' war. But like many gases that have been examined historically for this same purpose, or even, the purpose of terrorism, which we are getting into a bit this season, hydrogen cyanide was not effective in open air because it dispersed too quickly. So it was dismissed as a possibility by Fritz Haber himself. He was like, this isn't as good as mustard gas, phosgene, chlorine. We already have these three. We don't need cyanide, and it's not very good anyhow.
It's kind of like in the throwback to the botulism episode when they were talking about making the botulism grenades or whatever. Like,
exactly.
It doesn't hold in the air long enough. Okay.
Yeah. So Haber retained in 1917, he retained hydrogen cyanide for use in the War Ministry's Technical Committee for Pest Control. He was like, it's exclusively for pests. It's not really good for anything else, but it's great for pests. We should definitely keep it on hand. And so the cyanide was kept at military installations, border crossings, granaries. Like, it was pretty much everywhere. And because we knew it was poisonous to humans, it was dispersed by workers who wore protective suits and oxygen masks. And the way that they would disperse it was that they would mix the sodium cyanide with sulfuric acid diluted in a bit of water. And this would cause a reaction that would heat the cyanide and allow it to vaporize into gas. And so that's how they used it. They mixed it. So you didn't have to actually store the hydrogen gas like in an aerosol or like a pest spray or whatever.
It was dependent on the sulfuric acid and the water.
Yeah. Yep.
And so is the sulfuric acid, it doesn't make a gas, or is it deadly on its own?
So patrons who listened to our summer movie microdoses, they can compare that to hydrochloric acid, where you don't want to be breathing in sulfuric acid fumes. Like, that's not going to be good for you. But on its own in this use, I wouldn't say it's particularly deadly.
Okay.
You don't want to get it on your skin. You don't want to inhale it. But
Sure.
yeah. But Haber was so impressed and so satisfied with the efficacy of this gas that he wanted it to be publicly available so that anybody could use it for pest control. And so a public corporation called De Gesch was formed in 1919 and was headed by Fritz Haber. And it was then taken over in 1920 by a group of chemical firms and then acquired by Degussa, that company we were talking about before, who had an interest in cyanide. They took it over in 1922.
Okay.
But while I'm bringing up these other companies, let's talk about them, because they are major players. Like I said up top, there are a lot of people who are involved in this story. And of course, when companies are being discussed as having Nazi ties, IG Farben is like the major one that's brought up. I know Swindle did an episode on IG Farben. If you're talking about like people who still have ties to Nazis and like maybe their company should have been dismantled, like Bayer is brought up, Bayer aspirin, because it was part of IG Farben. So that's the big one. And Bayer, it started out on its own. It was a chemical manufacturer that began in 1863 as a dye maker.
The big dye boom you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And through hard work and luck, they ended up becoming a pharmaceutical manufacturer in 1888. And so they chased the Reichsmarks and in 1897 began producing a mild but effective form of aspirin for which Bayer would be known.
And still is known today.
Yeah. In 1916, the company which was manufacturing ammonia with the Haber-Bosch process was called BASF. And they, alongside Bayer, Agfa, Hoechst, Kalle, Casella, Greisheim Electron, and Weiler Termer, so a bunch of chemical companies, they become collaborators as a part of the Interessen Gemeinschaft der Deutschen Teefabern Industrie, which means the community of interests of the German dye industry. So all of these people, like I said, started out with German dyes and then kind of expanded from there. And that's a really long name, and so they just shortened it to the IG. So all of those became the IG. They mandated in the IG that as a community, they would work together on things like pricing, supply, research, patents, legal affairs, insurance, but they weren't a monopoly because they maintained separate entities and some of their profits would still only be shared with their old partners pre-collaboration. But the reason that they did this was very much framed, at least, as being in the interest of people, the interest of humanity, the world, because their chemists could still work and talk together, and that would just help everybody, which, yes, in an ideal world.
On paper, it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. So, when the first attempts were made to create a gaseous cyanide product that could be mass-produced, transported, and used by the common person, which was what Fritz Haber wanted, there were complications.
Of course there were.
In a liquid state, which was the preferential way to store it, hydrogen cyanide decomposes via polymerization and can explode.
Danger.
Yeah.
Danger
So,
canisters.
so scientists at Degesh decided that storing it as a gas would be the easier option. But you can't just store straight hydrogen cyanide because if the containers were compromised, you would kill everybody, right? So they were like,
Yeah.
that's not great. So what they
Still got
did,
a danger can situation.
danger can. So what they did was they used a non-volatile cyanide derivative that could be sprayed and then would transform to hydrogen cyanide in the presence of moisture and warmth. So essentially just in the air, it becomes hydrogen cyanide.
Okay.
Which, I mean, that's still not great because it's still like as it's escaping the canister, it becomes danger. Like it's still kind of a danger canister. But to kind of overcome that, they added an eye irritant to it. And so that would warn people of the danger of the gas and keep them away in the event of a leak.
Okay.
Or, if it was used regularly and so that you know that somebody has sprayed this and that you need to stay away because, like I said, we're just using it with abandon. And that's what consumers do, right? They're like, I can just spray a whole can of bug spray in my house and it's fine.
It's fine. Everything's fine. And so hopefully the eye irritant is enough.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
It did work fairly well because this formulation with the cyanide derivative and the eye irritant was patented in 1920 as Zyklon, which was a portmanteau of the German words for cyanide and chlorine, which translates also to cyclone.
Nice.
It was good, but it wasn't as good or safe as they had hoped. So
Not surprised.
I know, right?
We've done too many episodes about pesticides for me to believe that they're safe ever, like in their original creation. I know too much now to think that this could have gone well in the beginning.
Well, and do I ever tell you stories where I'm like, and then it worked out fine, yay!
And everything was fine. Ba-dum-bum.
End of episode. No. So the problem was that the eye irritant that was part of the formulation dissipated more quickly than the cyanide itself.
So the poison was hanging around longer in the air than the eye irritant.
Right, than the warning was. And so it led to deaths. And also, at the same time, 1920, the components used in poison gases, they were also the same kind of poisons that were used for the German army. They became banned by the Allies because they said, no, Germany, you don't get to use those anymore. And so, because loopholes are stupid, prussic acid wasn't banned. You could still use prussic acid.
Okay.
And so they were like, okay, well, we have this loophole. We'll use prussic acid. And it still wasn't like a great option for them, even though they found this loophole, because like making hydrogen cyanide available to everybody commercially had never been economical for them. Like it was one of those like it's a great idea for humanity because it gets pests out of your food and it saves you from lice and all of that. But it just isn't making the company any money. And now it was worse. And they had to deal with figuring out what to do with the tubs that the prussic acid was transported in. Because they were these huge tubs.
What was the reasoning for the cyanide gas to be banned, but not the prussic acid?
I'm really not sure why it was. It could be that the gas they were using, it must have been used in another gas or like as a precursor to something. But
it was useful for something else.
But prussic acid wasn't. And so they were like, well, you're not using it in warfare. You're not trying to kill anybody with it. So you can keep that. And so they're like, well, we can keep it, but it sucks. And then they just had to deal with it.
Gotcha.
So in 1922, the head of Degesh came up with the idea of soaking absorbent fossilized algae in the acid, in the prussic acid, and then sealing it in tightly packed cans, which was easy and safe to transport, which had been the issue all along, but was an even greater issue with the prussic acid. And the cans, unlike the regular prussic acid cans, had no danger in storing them until they could be picked up by the company or whoever for reuse, because Germany's always been super cool about recycling. Between 1923 and 1924, the safety of this method was further improved upon by adding another warning agent and a stabilizing agent to the acid. So, all good stuff here. They were finally able to patent and sell Zyklon again without the use of any banned substances that the Allies didn't want them using, and this time only government-certified practitioners were allowed to handle it. So it was not something that was, like, commercially available. You could get somebody to come out and, like, do it for you, right?
Okay.
And this is the birth of Zyklon B. But we're still pre-World War II, and that context is important. So we need to remember that Germany lost in World War I, and the Allies began to try to dismantle its power as much as possible. That's why they were like, you don't get to use these chemicals anymore. We're not going to be letting you create these chemicals anymore, so you're going to take a hit to your chemical industry. And so the companies that were in the IG were hit really hard because nitrogen could be implemented for the production of munitions, but also for fertilizer. It's that thing that Fritz Haber immediately saw. And the aspirin that Bayer produced was useful for people all around the world. But they were being eyed by the rest of the world, and they were taking economic losses. Also, the land and the companies were impounded by the Allied powers, and Germany lost 13% of its territory following the war.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. The chemists rallied to try to convince the Allies at Versailles, so the Treaty of Versailles, that they only had peace in mind. They weren't trying to manufacture stuff for warfare. The war was over. I mean, the idea of, like, better living through chemistry hadn't quite become commercialized yet, but this is what they were trying to say, is, like, we just want to help people,
We're the helpful guys.
We're trying to help. Like, yeah, chemicals can be used to injure people, but, like, world hunger and, like, elimination of pain, that's important. But ultimately at Versailles, the Germans lost this argument too. And the companies of the IG had to surrender 50% of their stocks to the Allies.
Oh, shit. That's a huge hit.
It's a huge hit. And then none of the confiscated assets or patents that were taken during the war were turned over. So now everybody else had, like, access to these things that they wouldn't normally have had access to. Yeah.
Like the Zyklon B?
The Zyklon B, the aspirin, the Haber-Bosch process. All of it. All of their patents were handed over, and there was no compensation for the loss. Bosch eventually, on his own, reached a deal with France that essentially saved the IG. He went and he was like, I'll give you this for that. And it wasn't great, but it allowed the chemical firms of Germany to continue. But, even after that, the Germans were still at a complete disadvantage economically following this. And so the chemists weren't happy. Germans on the whole were not happy with how things were going for them. Because, I mean, this is how things were all over the country, in all areas, in all industries. Like, yeah, people were suffering because of their government, for sure. But, yeah. When you're a company, it's hard to say that you're not, like, complicit in that. But people were suffering. It was a hard time.
It wasn't just the companies. It was everybody.
It was everybody. So, in 1925, as the German chemical industry was starting to rebuild and rebrand, the Interessengemeinschaft renamed itself IG Farben and came together as a single corporate entity, with some of the smaller companies being distinct subsidiaries of the company, but for the most part, it was just one.
They just all got lumped into one.
The ones who were already a part of the IG, so it's not like they were adopting other smaller companies. It's still not technically a monopoly. Not technically. Yeah.
Technically.
Yeah. By 1929, it employed over 120,000 people at 106 plants and mines, and IG Farben produced 100% of Germany's dyes, 85% of its nitrogen, and 41% of its pharmaceuticals. They also were producing mineral acids, rayon, explosive, photography supplies, pesticides, plastics, and a bunch of other stuff. So Yeah, not
So
technically
not
a
technically
monopoly.
a monopoly,
But it's
but
not.
as far as the dyes go, it was a dye monopoly.
It was a dye monopoly. Yeah.
I mean, and might as well be the nitrogen monopoly.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
might as well be.
Yeah.
But technically.
Not technically. Yeah.
Not technically. Okay.
So, initially, when Hitler began to stir things up and the Nazi Party began to first seed itself in Germany, the Nazis targeted IG Farben because many of their board members were Jewish. And they actually, IG Farben fired a Nazi employee who used slurs to describe one of the board members in an outside of work speech in 1927.
So they're pro-Jew in the company, and they're not tolerant of anti-Semitism in the beginning.
Yeah, they're at least not tolerant of anti-Semitism. I don't know if they're going out and saying, like, yeah, we're pro-Jewish, but they're at least not tolerating anti-Semitism to the point where, like, an outside of work speech got somebody fired.
Right.
Eventually, Hitler met with one of the senior chemists at IG Farben, who was impressed that Hitler seemed comfortable with chemical processes and talking about chemistry and what they did. But in the book I was reading for this, I read that it was probably just an act because somebody close to Hitler, after everything, later stated that he, quote, lacked any real fundamental understanding of scientific research. Which sounds familiar for some people who I've seen in power. But, you know, fake it till you make it, right?
Yeah, but it only gets you so far, and people can usually see through the veil.
Yeah, and I mean, the people close to him...
If you give them enough time.
Right, the people close to him, I think, could see through it soon enough, but the people at IG Farben didn't. You know, he seemed like he could talk the talk, and so they were impressed by him at that. And so after this meeting, you know, after they were like, we understand each other, whatever, I don't know. But the Nazis backed off from targeting IG Farben. And it wasn't long before Hitler reached out to industrialists in Germany looking for financial backing. And so he was having this speech in 1932, and 4 representatives from IG Farben attended. And the speech omitted any mention of Jewish people and mostly focused on private enterprise, the failure of democracy, and what the Nazis planned to do to save Germany with, you know, nationalism and all this shit if they won the election on May 5th. So that was their whole thing, was like, we need financial backing so that we can win this election. We need to be able to get the word out about the Nazi Party. And they were very specific about what they said to these industrialists. And then Hitler and Goering told everyone present that they either needed to financially support the Nazi Party or there would be a civil war. So they're trying to convince them, and then they're like, by the way, if you don't back us, we are going to make it so that life is fucking intolerable for all of you.
And your company is not going to survive.
Yeah, your company won't survive. So a month later, Karl Bosch made an enormous donation, you know, quotes. It wasn't donation, was it blackmail, on behalf of IG Farben to the Nazi Party. Converting from Reichsmarks to US dollars and then accounting for inflation, in 2022 dollars, it was nearly $37 million that he gave to the Nazi Party, which is
that's a huge, huge amount. Even like for today's campaign donation standards, that's a huge fucking amount.
I mean, yeah, and considering that like part of it was blackmail, like
true,
maybe they were very concerned, but it's like, I don't know. You're kind of, is that maybe you wanted to do this? This kind of seems like it's something that you were like super into doing. And
to me, the tune of $37 million sounds like you wanted some part of it.
Yeah. Like you're fine with parting with this much.
Yeah, because I mean, I don't know how much money their company was making, but $37 million is a lot of money. And I'd have to imagine that it would be something, it's not like you're writing a check to Bonnie's Bake Sale for $20 and accounting's not gonna notice it. Like That's enough to make all the shareholders' buttholes pucker a little bit,
Yeah.
I'd think.
I would think so, especially the Jewish shareholders. Like, what kind of
Yes.
message is this sending?
Right, because at this point in time, there's still Jewish members on the
Yes.
board
Yes,
and a
there
part
are.
of the company. Okay. Not a good look.
And so the Nazis, I mean, this was one of the donations they received, and so they were well backed now. And riots broke out. The Nazis controlled the police, and so dissidents were beaten and imprisoned. The party was able to afford to spread their propaganda far and wide, and certainly as a direct result of their ability to get some financial power, they ended up with 288 delegates in a parliament of 647, and another 52 were won by a Nazi coalition partner, meaning that in the parliament they now held an overall majority.
Nice.
Yeah. In March of 1933, the head of pharmaceuticals at IG Farben wrote a letter to all IG executives which stated that, quote, "The national revolution in Germany has developed with unparalleled peace and order. Since our immediate business interests have also been affected by these political developments, we feel it is important for this reason, but especially because of our duty as Germans, to tell you explicitly for our part as well that the contents of all atrocity tales being spread abroad about mistreatment of political opponents and Jews are in no way keeping with the facts."
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And IG Farben, I mean, this was one guy, but he is speaking for the company. He's putting the writing on the wall, at least. And IG Farben as a company was not alone in making this swing towards Nazi favoritism. One of the other chemical manufacturers outside the conglomerate, which, kept IG Farben from being a monopoly, was Degussa, the one that we mentioned earlier.
Yep.
And they were essentially the Nazi-approved chemical opponent to IG Farben. They acquired Degesch, so Haber's company, in 1922, the same year that Degesch was applying Zyklon B to fossilized algae. Degussa previously had no ties to Nazis prior to 1933, but when the Nazis were asserting their power, the board of directors had no problem bending to the will of the Nazis, especially when it granted them this state-approved power. Before the party even decided to take an interest in them, in 1933, Degussa asserted that, quote, "The entire managing board of our enterprise is purely of the Christian faith, that our firm has never employed Jews since its foundations in 1873, and there are also today among its approximately 1,150 workers and about 700 commercial and technical employees and graduates, no adherents to the Jewish faith." Which was unlikely
weird
to have even been true. Yeah, weird flex,
Right.
but also probably a lie. Because this would have been like them admitting to breaking a law for employment equality that was established in Germany in 1867. And 5% of the population was Jewish in Germany at that time.
So there was a good chance. But they were just jumping on board saying, like, oh no, see, we're Jew free.
Yeah. Like, come
Oh my God.
support us.
It's terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
See, come, let us continue with our Nazi pride.
Yeah.
Okay.
So at IG Farben, Karl Bosch was unsettled, to say the least, about statements being made by his colleagues about his other colleagues. So, the head of pharmaceuticals is speaking for the whole company, and Karl Bosch is like, nope, can't say that I agree with that. Especially because he was close with Fritz Haber, who, despite his German nationalism, he actually converted to Christianity, and he was still forced from his position at the University of Berlin and was expelled from Germany in 1933. And then other scientists, like Max Planck, tried to reason directly with Hitler to explain that he was losing a valuable scientist who could help the country. But Hitler belligerently argued that a Jew is a Jew.
Oh my God.
Haber would die in Switzerland the following year, and perhaps for the best, so that he could not see what would happen with one of his own insecticides. Because shit's about to get real dark. We're about to really get into it. From 1939 to 1945 in Germany, Zyklon B was the primary vaporizing pesticide used in the fumigation of military quarters, supplies, uniforms, vehicles, and food storehouses and milling facilities. So basically the way that cyanide...
Everything.
It was used in everything, but this was also how they always used it since, like, vaporizing cyanide had been used. Like, this was what they used it for. This was not unusual. It was stored safely. It was picked up safely. It had a warning agent. You know, it was considered
Things
very
were all
safe.
above board.
Totally above board. In late 1936, IG Farben also began producing chemical weapons. The company had experience with chemical weapons in World War I, which were created by Fritz Haber, but that tarnished both his reputation and theirs. And then chemicals were outright banned for warfare, right? So, like, this should not have been happening. Like, there was no reason for this to be happening except the escalation of the Nazi Party and, you know, the approach of World War II.
And they're like, well, we want to get in on this game. If Degussa is in on it, why are we just sitting here? Why can't we play too?
Right, yes. And, you know, they're basically the chemical monopoly, so they have the means to do it. And IG Farben is the company that created the nerve agents Tabun and Sarin.
So they were behind a lot.
Yeah. That same year, 1936, IG Farben held 42.5% of the shares of Degesch alongside Degussa. You have the Nazi-approved Degussa, and you have IG Farben, and they both hold almost 50% of Degesch. And the chemical industry, still not quite a monopoly. The dye industry, as we already established, was. But it could basically be described as a cartel at this point because they were being heavily swayed by the Nazis.
Well, yeah, they're doing anything that they want.
While members at IG Farben and their contemporaries were trying to reason with the Nazis, be like, you know, you're losing Fritz Haber and he's valuable. And of course, while they're also making chemical weapons, and it's individuals in the company, but as on the whole, the company has this like Nazi trajectory. Degussa was more than willing to go along with the Nazi directives. They didn't have, you know, there are no records at least that show anybody who's like, tap the brakes a little. Yeah, no qualms. And since they had favor with the Nazis and since they never questioned them, they were able to expand. They were able to legally and illegally purge Jewish workers from their company, buy shares in chemical providers silently, acquire land and businesses formerly owned by Jewish people, right? And Degussa was the first company, you know, between Degussa and IG Farben to engage in this kind of behavior. But by 1938, IG Farben had followed in suit and had fired all of their Jewish board members and employees, and also began predatory absorption of land in companies previously owned by Jews.
Fuck.
Their size and their enormous power in Germany also allowed them to take advantage of the German occupancy of other companies as the war progressed, and they also seized foreign land and companies. And IG Farben...
They're all in.
They are all in. They're all in. And IG Farben did well in the early years of the war because they provided chemicals to the German army, but they also controlled most of the chemicals that citizens needed. And so they were able to survive losing international markets once they started to spread and people were like, hey, no, we're not okay with this. They were able to survive because they controlled so much of the market. By 1936, they had also abandoned their practice of hiring Jewish workers. And, you know, they were on their way to firing everybody that they already had. And they were supporting the Nazis with supplies in such a fashion that they could not have even denied knowing they were supporting and extending the war effort. And they even built secret plants that exclusively manufactured products for the military.
So they're not only all in, but they are a gear in the war machine.
Yes.
At this point.
Absolutely.
And And it's not something that slowly happened. They were like blatantly exploding expansion.
Yeah.
It sounds like. And so did Degussa make all of the chemicals themselves
No,
or like
no. So
an
even
IG
though,
or was
like,
there external help?
yeah, even though there's like all of these big player companies, they still have to have their suppliers. So Calaverke Colon was the company that Degussa relied on for sodium cyanide. That was who
Okay.
produced it. And then Degussa cornered the sales on the global market. So they got it from another company and then they sold it. Um,
Gotcha.
and even though they were selling it, Degesh's name was on all of the products passed to consumers. So it was basically all of them. Everybody
Okay.
was
It
involved
was a big circle jerk.
in Zyklon B. Yeah. IG Farben made the stabilizing agent in Zyklon B. Degesh made the absorbent packing material, and then the warning agent, that irritant, was made by a different company. And then Degussa also owned a smaller company who found a cheaper way to make the precursor cyanide from the nitrogenous waste of beets, which actually also
Okay.
relates back to Fritz Haber.
Oh yeah,
Um,
with the plants.
with the
Yep.
plants, yeah. So it's a lot of people who are involved in this, but it's only a couple people who are making like the big money off of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then two vendors originally made it available for purchase, but then this company, Tesh and Stabenow, who were actually chemists who helped formulate Zyklon B, they were given exclusive distribution rights in 1925. And then Tesh would later join the Nazi Party in 1933.
So he was an easy vote
Yeah, he was an
for
easy vote. And
the
like,
pro-war movement.
I don't know, it's like Haber and Bosch were not, but everybody else is. Like Haber and Bosch were like, look at this thing that can get pests out of everything. And then all of these Nazis were like, oh, yes, let's take that.
We'd
It's
like some,
crazy.
please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as I already said, hydrocyanic gas wasn't that economical. At no point was it ever really economical. It became more efficient and more safe and a little bit easier and more economical to transport and sell, but it still never became like amazing by any means. Even with the improved shipping and safety measures, it was still more dangerous to use than arsenic, sulfur, or steam based pesticides. And then with the rise of World War II, sales didn't significantly improve like Degussa had anticipated. Because they were like, okay, it's wartime again, and so we're going to need it for fumigating military uniforms and food stores like we had in World War I. But there was actually a shortage of nearly all the necessary materials from these smaller companies that helped manufacture Zyklon B between 1938 and 1943. And the sale of sulfur-based ingredients doubled. So it's interesting to see that and then know what comes next, because it's kind of like you can look at that and be like, so you were intentionally doing this then, like there's
Right.
no way around you
Yeah.
were intentionally doing this.
You knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
Not fun times.
No, nope, none of these are fun times.
If it was more dangerous and supplies were limited, though, why continue to focus on it?
Because for Degesh specifically, it was still fairly lucrative, and they kind of still depended on it to stay afloat as a company.
Okay.
They required so much of it be made for the delousing of barracks in the war effort that two other companies, Dessau and Colon, both had to work their companies for 3 shifts a day to keep up with the demand.
Oh, geez. They were going through gobs of this then.
Yeah. And part of why Zyklon B was working out so well for Degesh, but not necessarily anybody else, like Degussa or anybody, was because this is just, it gets so dark with every step, but Degesh was manufacturing circulation chambers to accompany the bulk sale of Zyklon B canisters. But at this point, there's still plausible deniability because it was being used in soldier barracks. You would pile all of the clothes into this barrack, and then it would safely circulate through and then push the gas out, and now everything's fumigated. So they sold these big chambers, hoods, whatever, to fumigate the clothes and the bedspreads. And the chambers sold really
So that
well.
they could do it, so that they could do more at a time.
Yes, and do it safely.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's part of why.
But I already know where, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Because what's a Nazi going to do when they got to do their Nazi in business?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in 1939, the Nazis upped the ante. Reinhard Heydrich and Hermann Goering drafted a letter on July 3rd to the Einsatzgruppen of the SS, which read, quote, supplementing the task that was assigned to you on 24 January 1939, which dealt with the solution of the Jewish problem by emigration and evacuation in the most suitable way, I hereby charge you to submit a blueprint of the organizational, subject-related, and material preparatory measures for the execution of the intended final solution of the Jewish question.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Now we're getting dark.
Dark.
Last chance to turn around.
I know. It's okay if you pause here because it's too much, because it just gets worse, and we all know that. But within months, huge numbers of Jewish people were being rounded up and deported from Eastern territories via train. In October of 1941, 20,000 Jewish people were brought by train to Lodz, Poland, and normally, for what was going on at the time, they would have been shot as soon as they stepped off the train. But because Goering and Heydrich had upped the ante, they had too many people this time around. So an SS officer ordered that the prisoners be loaded into trucks to Chełmno, Poland, and then transferred to sealed vans where they would be suffocated to death with exhaust fumes by the hundreds. And this single instance became the pivot point for the genocide. And within the next 2 years, 360,000 people would be murdered in this way in Chełmno alone.
Jesus.
And within the Reich, gas tanks of carbon monoxide were obtained from IG Farben. But in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, these were too expensive, and so diesel engines were used instead.
Well, God forbid that genocide be costly.
All right, I just need to take a mental break and talk about literally anything else for like half a second. The concentration camp at Auschwitz, Poland was established in 1940, and IG Farben was directly involved in its creation because one of the original purposes for Auschwitz being built was as a plastics and artificial rubber plant for IG Farben to support the war effort using prison labor.
So brought to you by IG Farben for IG Farben.
Yes.
Got it.
In fact, the plant at Auschwitz, which was officially called Bühnewerke, was nicknamed IG Auschwitz.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Now, for a plant of this size to run properly, the inmate population originally anticipated for the camp had to be increased from 10,000 to 30,000, making it the largest concentration camp during the Holocaust. And it was controlled primarily by two IG Farben representatives, Otto Ambros and Heinrich Butefische. IG Farben paid the SS 3 Reichsmarks per day for unskilled workers, 4 Reichsmarks per day for skilled workers, and a Reichsmark and a half per day for children working at the camp. So, of course, the people, the prisoners were not paid. But for, like heads of cattle, essentially, IG Farben paid the SS. In addition to the workers at Auschwitz, IG also paid for 11,000 workers from a concentration camp in Monowitz to mine coal for them. And like I said, they were not only paid for like heads of cattle and they were given less than the animals would be. Their clothes weren't taken care of. They weren't given a sufficient diet to match the labor they were being demanded to provide. And they weren't allowed to bathe regularly because soap was considered a luxury. And, I mean, most of us know this, but at night, they had to sleep head to toe with 2 or 3 people in a single bed of a bunk, and the bunk was just wood covered in straw with a thin blanket. And this is what IG Farben
calling
was
it a
paying
bed.
For. Yeah.
Yeah. Calling it a bed is being generous.
So, fumigation chambers. Technicians installed a fumigation chamber for the SS guards' linens at Auschwitz between July 5th through the 11th, 1940. That same year, a chamber was also installed at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. By the end of 1942, the SS had ordered another 23 chambers, and Auschwitz alone had ordered another 19, although those ones weren't delivered for whatever reason, supply lines, whatever.
23 still seems like a lot.
Yeah. Tesh and Stabenow were also paid for the training that went along with these delousing chambers being installed, and they were more than happy to install 23 of them in the same camp because they get paid for the training.
Yeah, but it'd be hard to believe in the naivety of these people to think like we need 23 delousing chambers. Like
people had to have seen where it was going, and they just didn't care.
They had to have known.
Yeah. So the SS convinced the agriculture and interior ministers to waive the oversight and restrictions usually placed on suppliers of prussic acid for their SS officers in April of 1941. So usually prussic acid had to be handled a certain way and with certain oversight, and they did. They waived that for SS officers. And at that point, Tesh was no longer conducting fumigations, but was still responsible for selling Zyklon B to the Black Corps and educating the prisoners on how to operate the circulation chambers.
Oh my God.
Now, Tesh and his co-executive Karl Weinbacher hold the distinction of becoming the only businessmen to be executed for their role in Nazi atrocities in Western Europe. They didn't simply cooperate with the Nazis here. They had economic reasons for looking the other way because the SS were significantly boosting their purchases of Zyklon B after they received the waiver on oversights. Tesh sold the SS at Auschwitz and Majdanek at least 29.4 metric tons of Zyklon B from 1942 to 1944. And another 14.8 to roughly 15.2 tons was sold to other concentration camps.
There's not enough delousing to be done.
No. The plausible deniability is...
Yeah, it's out the window at this point.
Yeah.
It's out the window. Like, you have to know.
Yeah. So the first tests of Zyklon B on prisoners at Auschwitz occurred in August 1941. And the first mass killings followed a month later, on September 5th, when 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 other sick prisoners were gassed in basement cells of the punishment block. After this first mass murder with Zyklon B, the poisonings were continued but moved directly to the camp crematorium, which was made into a gas chamber by sealing the doors and creating openings in the ceiling so that the pellets could be poured into the chamber from above.
Now, were the pellets what the Zyklon B was?
It's the fossilized algae, yeah.
Oh, okay, gotcha, yeah.
And when I say it was poured in from above, it was poured into a cone that was just above, so you could close the chamber, but it would be held, and then you could take it out when you, yeah.
We're done.
When you were done, yeah. Tesh and his subordinates did not design, build, or operate the gas chambers disguised as showers in Auschwitz-Birkenau, but they knew about them by the end of 1942. And we know this because Tesh actually dictated a note after a trip to Berlin in June of that year that explicitly stated he knew that was the purpose of Zyklon B at that point. It was
so he's not even hiding it at this point.
This is part of the reason that he was executed, because this note was seen by two other employees who became whistleblowers on the company when they reported this information to the British occupying Hamburg in 1945. And the note described how the SS asked if Zyklon B could possibly be used to kill Jewish people, and Tesh said it could be used in exactly the same way it's used on insects, and then he showed them how to do it.
Jesus fucking Christ. Like, what?
Yeah. Now, the actual note was destroyed before Tesh went on trial because...
Oh, okay, sure.
They were destroying documents, but there was no evidence to disprove the witnesses who had seen it either. So you had multiple people corroborating what this note said.
Mm-hmm.
And one secretary even wondered aloud at Tess's company, Testa, if the Zyklon B being ordered could really be for fumigation, because she was like, "Oh, this is a lot of Zyklon B.
This is a lot." Like,
and another man who was probably also a Nazi told her, quote, "If you repeat such remarks, I must report you to the authorities." By 1943, Degussa had begun gradually moving towards chemicals that were also known to be used for murder. Degussa was already familiar.
They're just murder incorporated at this point.
Yeah, basically. And they were already familiar with a lot of their chemicals as part of their regular functions, liquid metals, cyanide. But they had also recently bought into carbonization as a way to compete with IG Farben. So now it's like murder is what they're selling. It is what they're competing against. It's a branch of their company. And when I was thinking about how to structure this cyanide series that we're having this season, this is what I wanted to examine when I started researching. I already knew that the Nazis used Zyklon B. They used it to kill about 1.1 million people. But I wanted to know why Zyklon B was used. Why cyanide, And I figured the answer had something to do with convenience, money. But this is the reason. It was a handful of companies that had the means and were eager to please and participate in war crimes, It wasn't just Tesh that was selling tons and tons of Zyklon B. There were contracts drawn up and monopolies discussed, and other companies who were in on selling Zyklon B. For instance, the company Heli sent 2.2 tons to Mauthausen from 1942 to 1943. Colon sent 400 kilograms to Theresienstadt in 1944, and they sent another 44 tons to a single person at Mauthausen.
Nobody needs 44 tons or 2 tons of Zyklon B. Nobody needs that much.
And there's too many people to name. There's too many companies in particular to defer to different individuals. Documentation was destroyed. But there are names worth mentioning. I don't like mentioning the names of the perpetrators because there's 6 million names that are lost forever.
Mm-hmm.
But some of them are worth mentioning just so we know how this played out later. So one of them was Dr. Gerhard Peters, who became a Dagesh business manager in 1939 and then went on to lead Heli temporarily in 1941. In 1942, he was the head of the Working Committee for Disinfestation and Epidemic Control in the Armaments Ministry. So if there was somebody who could easily be identified as having deeply vested interest in Zyklon B, it was him. In 1943, Peters met an SS officer who was part of the anti-epidemic staff and was already deeply involved in the brutal details of the genocide. The year before meeting Peters, the officer, who was named Kurt Gerstein, witnessed a massacre of Jewish people at the time that was being covered up as an attempt to control typhus. So that's where the anti-epidemic part comes in.
Mm.
But at the time, it was being carried out with carbon monoxide. And
that'll definitely get rid of
typhus.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, we discussed carbon monoxide in season 1. It can take quite a long time to be fatal. And Gerstein, he saw this. He was allegedly horrified. He took it upon himself to find a faster, more reliable means of execution. And that's how he came to be introduced to Peters.
Well, how wide of him?
Yeah. In this meeting, Gerstein stressed the national importance for carrying out Himmler's orders. And that led to Gerstein and Peters coming to an agreement that Peters would supply Gerstein with Zyklon B without the warning agent. Gerstein said that he wanted the deaths caused by the gas to be more humane. And I read one account that said he was devastated by watching the gassing deaths, and he was trying to use his position as an SS officer to make the situation better however he could, right? But, Zyklon B was not better than carbon monoxide. Sometimes the last people to succumb to Zyklon B would be writhing in pain for 30 minutes. Some witnesses from the first use of Zyklon B in that basement at Auschwitz, they claimed that there were people who survived the first dose of poisoning for 2 days.
Oh
2
my
days.
gosh.
And they were given a second dose to kill them later because, the Nazis didn't know how much Zyklon B was needed to kill humans because it had only been used as a pesticide. So these were their human trials.
This is unnerving, and honestly, like, they were probably like, please shoot me at this point. Like, they were like,
Probably, yeah.
like, we're begging to be shot instead of dealing with this. Jesus.
So the fucked up thing about the meeting between Gerstein and Peters and the 400 cans of Zyklon per month that were sent to Gerstein without the warning agent is that Peters was eventually completely acquitted of any involvement in this situation.
The fuck?
The use of gas for execution or euthanasia was illegal at the time, and so it was something that both Gerstein and Peters could be charged with, or at least conspiracy of. But Peters claimed that he thought it was really, what Himmler and Hitler wanted, and Gerstein was just trying to fulfill the duties handed down. The whole Nuremberg
Shit
defense.
rolls downhill. Oh, yeah.
I was just doing my job. I was just going along with it. As it turns out, Gerstein, according to that same thing that I read where, Gerstein was horrified and he wanted to try to make it better. He is apparently equally horrified by watching Zyklon B because, as I said, it's not any better. And so he tried to destroy the Zyklon B that he had acquired, and then eventually he spilt the information he knew to a Swedish diplomat, but the damage had been done. This Zyklon B without the warning agent was being sent out.
So they were using it with the warning agent before then, though?
Yeah. And so as it came...
So it's even more painful.
Yeah, because of the eye irritation and because you know what's happening if you've smelt it or, been around it before, felt it before, you know what's happening. I can't see it as really, like, this Gerstein guy was eventually, like, his family weighed in and they were like, he was trying to help, and I guess his reputation has been, like, kind of saved, and he's kind of viewed as a hero of the war now. And, like, we'll talk about him later at the end of the episode, and we'll say where he ended up. But, like, it really just felt to me when I was reading it that, like, it was easier to get the next batch of people in because they didn't have to wait for the warning agent to dissipate. Once the warm air filtered it out of the room and the Nazis could go in and remove the bodies, they could just send in...
So it was more for the facilitators than
That's
prisoners.
how I read it. Yeah. That it made it a lot...
That's fucked up. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. So... And there were IG foremen on the premises as well. So let's not forget that it's not just the SS and, prisoners being forced to do it. But the IG foremen were on the premises of the concentration camp. And they were there while the executions were being conducted. They themselves would beat prisoners for pausing in their work until they resumed or died. And sometimes they even surpassed the SS officers in their brutality. Prisoners were pressed to work for long hours with no energy and would sometimes just drop dead in the line of working, trying to keep up the pace for IG Farben.
So they're murder junioring, but they're taking...
Yeah.
Because did Dagesh have people on site like this other than the setup?
Nope.
Just IG Farben?
Just IG Farben, yeah.
Okay.
And it's not like IG Farben was even trying to cover up their behavior, because by mid-1943, most of the people who worked for the company were aware of the company's involvement with the concentration camps, and 2,500 of them actually worked or lived on the Bunaverka campus, so fucking Auschwitz, right?
Yeah.
And were aware of the stench and the smoke that constantly emanated from the prison camp side. On Wehrmacht Day in March of that year, 1943, several civilian employees of IG Farben were invited inside the gates by officers to visit the camp for dinner and holiday entertainment.
This is so terrible.
I know. One British prisoner of war, Charles Coward, was quoted as saying, "Of course, all the Farben people knew what was going on. Nobody could live at Auschwitz and work in the plant or even come down to the plant without knowing what was common knowledge to everybody." All of the top executives at IG Farben must have known what was going on as well, even if it was never communicated in writing, because again, that documentation was gone. But all of them, all of these top execs at IG Farben visited the camp at least once between 1942 and 1944.
So they had to know, even, but I would venture to say that even if they hadn't visited the camps, they had to know what was going on because
Right?
they weren't selling 44 metric tons of Zyklon B prior to the war. They
Yeah.
weren't selling chambers out the asshole. Like they were all complicit in this.
Well, and
Whether
like I
they
said earlier, they
like
weren't selling 44 metric tons of a sulfur-based pesticide.
right.
Yeah.
There's no way
Mm-mm.
to say that they didn't know. Every single one of them's complicit.
Yeah, and I mean, Bayer drugs were even used being experimentally on prisoners by the angel of death himself, Josef Mengele. He was paid by the company, supposedly in the name of R&D, to do tests. And so all of the atrocities that are associated with him, those were funded by IG Farben and reported back to them as human experiments.
Wow.
IG Farben pulled its employees out of Auschwitz in January of 1945 as the Russian army drew near, and they attempted to destroy the evidence of their deeds by burning as much as they could, which is why we lack some of this documentation. The executives of the company had already begun drafting their alibis and excuses the year before when it became clear how things were going to look for them when the war was finally over.
Well, yeah, they were probably quaking in their boots because, like, yeah, so we just participated in mass genocide.
Yeah.
The war's going to be over at some point. What are we going to say about that?
Yeah, because it doesn't look like we're going to be the victors.
Yeah.
So, in August of 1945, the Potsdam Conference divided Germany into 4 zones and sought to denazify and decartelize the industries which had assisted in the war effort so they could never amass such power again. It's basically what they did after World War One, but now they're like, Jesus Christ, what the fuck is your problem? We need to separate you.
Yeah,
So,
go play in the corner.
yeah. So, the next month, General Eisenhower ordered that all IG plants which had operated for war-making purposes be destroyed and their facilities be divided for reparation, which essentially ended IG Farben. However, the plants were mostly absorbed by the Soviet Union, which made it difficult for the United States to assess what should be done. Who was the greater enemy, the communists of the Soviet Union or the Nazis who already had assets which could be useful in the fight against communism in Europe? 24 IG Farben executives were indicted on behalf of the United States in May of 1947 for 5 separate counts, including planning, preparation, and waging of war on other countries, plunder and spoliation, slavery and mass murder, membership in criminal organizations, and crimes against peace. 9 were found guilty of spoliation and murder. 5 were found guilty of slavery and mass murder, including Ambrose and Budafish. In total, 13 were charged, and none were sentenced to more than 8 years in prison, while the other 11 were completely set free.
That is so dissatisfying.
I know.
More people were killed, like millions more people were killed than each year spent in prison.
Yeah. Once he was released, Otto Ambrose, who planned and ran IG Auschwitz, created a secret chemical weapons program for the war effort and received a Knight's Cross from Adolf Hitler himself. He served on the board of Chemie Grunenthal, the maker of thalidomide.
Oh. Yeah,
Yeah.
go listen to that episode if you haven't heard it. That's a fun tale, too.
Yeah, maybe take a day in between. Like, mental health is important.
Yeah, that's, probably a good idea.
But yeah, good playmates up there at Chemie Grunenthal. All of the charges brought against the managing board and the administrative committee at Degussa were also dropped, either because they really didn't know what was happening or there was enough plausible deniability to suggest that they really just thought the Zyklon B being sold to different concentration camps was actually being used for intense pesticide control.
Give me a fucking break.
Fucking no, right? However, it is noteworthy that Degussa's lawyers were employed in defending Gerhard Peters in his trials between 1948 and 1945 that resulted in his acquittal.
So he gets off scot-free too. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
The dissolution of IG Farben was postponed until 1949. But in 1951, the companies Bayer, Herscht, and BASF were reopened, along with 6 smaller companies that included Agfa, Kalle, Casella, and Huels. By the 1970s, the 3 largest had exceeded their 1936 levels and absorbed the 6 smaller companies and were now among the 30 largest corporations worldwide. Bayer is still the largest producer of aspirin and among the top 10 largest pharmaceutical companies. And BASF Group is the world's largest group of chemical companies.
Okay. Well, they're doing well. I love to see it. Not.
Zyklon itself continued to be sold in Germany through 1974. It was renamed Cyanosil and then continued to be sold until 1986 when Degesch was sold to another company and renamed Deschia Degesch GmbH.
Okay, so we have a little bit of a branding change because things for the Zyklon name weren't so market friendly.
Yeah. Bruno Tesch and his co-executive, Karl Weinbacher, were found guilty of violating the Hague Convention of 1907, essentially a chemical warfare convention, and hanged on May 16th, 1946. So Gerhard Peters, I mentioned earlier that he was acquitted with help from Degesch's from help with Degusa's legal team, actually, yeah. He was originally sentenced to 5 years in prison for accessory to manslaughter and 3 years for loss of honor, but then he was acquitted. Kurt Gerstein...
Yeah, but even if he served all 8 years, as if it's enough.
As if, right? Kurt Gerstein, the SS officers who got Peters to sell him Zyklon B without the warning agent, was captured by the French after the war, charged with war crimes, and died in prison, possibly by his own hand. And as I said earlier, eventually his family worked hard and, fixed his reputation as a hero to try to sabotage the war from within. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that narrative,
Yeah, I mean, all he did, let's say they didn't get rid of the warning agent to increase the amount of people who could go in and out of the chambers. Let's say he really did do it for good. Was that really hero shit?
Right. Yeah.
You're still letting millions of people be murdered. That's not really hero shit. I'm sorry.
And one of the most complicated and controversial characters in this story, Fritz Haber, the Jewish chemist who helped invent Zyklon B and a number of other chemical weapons, died in Switzerland as an exile from Germany in 1934. Karl Bosch drank himself to death in 1939 after being removed from all positions of power for speaking out against Hitler and the Nazi Party.
I think you're right about Haber, though. Maybe it was for the best that he died before all of this happened.
Yeah.
Because even though he was the chemist of the wars, that would be a lot to swallow, knowing what happened with your creation after the fact.
Yeah. So, long story, complicated story, tragic story, but, the Nazis, they didn't do it alone. It wasn't just Hitler who forced his way into the power that he got. There were people who believed the lies and they wanted a scapegoat for the problems in their lives. They wanted the same scapegoat that's always been used, and they were willing to accept whatever they were told. So they were willing to accept some bullshit that's as old as time. And I think that's part of the difference between the Nazis, who we have no sympathy for whatsoever, and someone like Giuliano Tofana, who also had pretty high body count. Not 6 million people, but pretty high. You and I were pretty light in the Aqua Tofana episode, but it was because, it was people who literally were disempowered, whereas the Nazis were just selling this, this story of being disempowered. But the people who they were targeting were already people who had a position of less power in their community. Jewish people, Romani people, disabled people, gay and queer individuals. And they perceived them as having more power than them, but it's just that they didn't like them. And
yeah, that's all it was.
Yeah, so
there's no bones about him.
I don't know. Like, I think chemistry is interesting. I think chemistry is cool. I think poisons and their effect on the body, it's fascinating to me, but
it also has a haunting value to it.
Yeah, like anything, it can be used for good, it can be used for evil, it can be used to perpetuate systemic disparities. So if you guys made it to the end of this episode, good job. This was a rough episode to research. It was a rough episode to record, but I really wanted to tell the story. I really wanted to know why this happened. How did chemistry play a part, such a big part in fairly recent history like this?
Yeah, because we're still not a century past.
No. And this is just the beginning of the story of cyanide. This is the early part of the story of cyanide. So I don't think that the rest of this month is going to be as heavy as this, but it's going to be a doozy. The cyanide series is going to be kind of a rough one to listen to. So,
well, we hope to see you all around for part 2, where we go to Jonestown.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of cults this season. So
buckle up.
Buckle the fuck up.
And thanks for listening.
Take care of yourselves. Go stand in the sunshine now.
And touch some grass. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Deneco. Stay safe, and remember,
the dose makes the poison.